Hello, everybody. Hi. So I'm here to talk about ArchivesSnake, or ASnake as it's often referred to. And it's a community-developed Python API client. So it's not just me. Greg Wiedemann actually helps out a bunch, and he's in here somewhere. There he is. And also Hillel, Arnold, and Patrick Galligan at the basically a bunch of people help out. What's that? Why are you doing this? No. Over the one picture. The one picture I put in here. So anyway, while we wait for that to load. So ArchivesSnake is a Python client library for the API. And what that essentially means is it's a piece of software that's meant to make it easier to use the API by taking common tasks and things that are duplicated in all the scripts that people have been writing and centralizing them in one place. Things like handling authorization, everyone has to do it. It's the same every time. And we're also trying to capture sort of a body of examples and knowledge on the API. Most of that is getting put into the GitHub repository, but we're hoping to also have a set of utilities that sort of handle more complex, commonly done tasks. And we've got sort of an annotated bibliography of a lot of the scripting work that's been done. And if you've got scripts that aren't on there, you can add them. So in order to get ArchivesSnake at this point, all you should have to do is, assuming you have a working Python install, do pip3 install ArchivesSnake. So ArchivesSnake lets you define your configuration in a file called archivesnake.yaml, which is essentially just a type of configuration file. It also lets you configure it when you instantiate an object, like when you start your script, or in sort of various other ways. Sorry, I'm a little discombobulated today. So here's what it looks like to actually run ArchivesSnake over some sort of fairly low bar things to do. So up here you see we sort of import the ASnake client class, which is the class that sort of represents the ArchivesSnake client. And then we authorize it and get back that header there, but notice that we don't actually have to keep track of that and put it into headers because it's held in that object and sort of managed. So here we're getting the first resource in the second repository, and it returns a regular sort of request response object, which if you've done any scripting around the API in Python, most of those are using requests, so it should be somewhat familiar. And then you can get the JSON out of it, and it's cut off because it's quite long, but you can see this is a record titled Recordy, with a number of fields in it. So you can do not just reading with this, you can also get a resource, edit it in some way, and then post back that JSON, and you'll have altered your records. This is sort of the central workflow of doing updates with the API. You get an object, alter the JSON that you get back, and then post it back to the API. One convenience that we have on this sort of client level is that there's a getPaged function, which gives you a generator object over all of the records at an endpoint, if the endpoint has sort of a list of records. To sort of put this in plainer terms, you can do a regular Python loop over all of the repositories in ASpace, or over all of the resources in a repository. So here you see we're taking all of the repositories and then printing out the name of the repo. Wait, sorry. All of that is sort of the client layer of ArchivesSnake, which is a very thin layer over requests. It basically handles authorization and paged records and not much else. And handles having a base URL, so you can just pass URIs from ArchivesSpace directly into it, rather than having to always add, this is where my API is, plus this is where the URI is. There's also a component to ASnake, which is being actively developed now, called the abstraction layer, which is read-only for right now, but is a higher level way of kind of getting into ArchivesSpace and getting sort of large amounts of data out. Basically, you see it's a different object. It's the ASpace object, and with this, you basically have a object that represents the route, and then you can feed that object an ID to get back an individual object, or you can, and then you can take that individual object and get individual properties of it without having to go into the JSON. You can also, you can also just iterate directly over those routes to get all of the objects in them. So it lets you do some things fairly conveniently and shortly, and has a few convenience methods so that you can go over all the resources in ASpace for all the repositories without having to go through each repo. And you can basically iterate over everything in a tree. Thank you very much. Image on slide 1 is from Badger, an old school Flash video. And that's me. Thanks.